Good evening. Very nice to be with you virtually in Warsaw, overcoming the usual technical glitches. Your subject is the pandemic, liberalism, and the future. I'm going to say just a few words about the pandemic and then turn to liberalism and the future. Watching Polish television news last night, and when I say Polish television news, I mean TVN Fakty, I was horrified to see those pictures of ambulances with desperately ill patients queuing up outside the hospitals because there were not enough beds in those hospitals. And it reminded me not only of the tragic nature of the crisis we're in, but also of, I think, one political insight, one thing we can already say about the pandemic politically. We can't say democracies did better than authoritarian regimes, because actually there have been democracies that have done very well and democracies that have done very badly, dictatorships that have done quite well and dictatorships that have done quite badly. But what we can say is that because this requires a high level of competence and realism in government, populists across the board have done badly in responding to COVID-19, be it Trump's USA, Boris Johnson's Britain, Jarosław Kaczynski's Poland, or Bolsonaro's Brazil. And there's a reason for that, which is that populists are very good at rhetoric, they're very good at words, and that's not to be underestimated, bringing people together with a warm, embracing rhetoric of community. But they're not so good at doing things. So that's point number one about the pandemic. Point number two about the pandemic is you have to beware the problem of perspective. In perspective, as you all know, things closer to you look bigger. So there is an almost unavoidable tendency to overestimate the impact of things that are close to you. So we have the 9/11 terror attacks. People say that changes everything. Well, no, it didn't change everything. It changed a lot, but not everything. Eurozone crisis. Again, people say that changes everything. Well, no, it changed some things, but not everything. Ukraine, refugee crisis, now COVID. So I would caution against a hyperbole around the pandemic. My hunch is, it's too soon to say, but my hunch is that it will actually act more as a catalyst, an intensifier of existing trends, positive and negative, rather than as a kind of separate historical event, certainly one on the scale of, say, 1989. Turning to liberalism and the future in the light of the pandemic, as Rafał Trzaskowski already said, liberals, and by the way, when I say liberals, I mean those whose central political value is liberty. That is small L liberalism. It's a broad church. It includes liberal conservatives and liberal social democrats. We liberals, in that broad sense, face three simultaneous challenges, three baskets of things that we have to address at the same time. Firstly, old, familiar truths, institutions, values of liberalism that are under attack. Secondly, the mistakes that have been made in the name of liberalism over the last 30 years, mistakes both of omission and of commission. And thirdly, wholly new global challenges, of which the pandemic is one. So let me take those in turn. I mean, first of all, while we're talking about the new, there are a set of old classic truths of political liberalism, institutions of political liberalism, the need for limited government, separation of powers, the rule of law, independent courts, independent civil society, local government, all the anti-majoritarian institutions. Jan Werner Müller, who I think will speak later, says the opposite of populism is pluralism. The target of populism is pluralism. So all the elements of pluralism in our societies, free speech, and of course the media we need for free speech. That's nothing new. kilka myślom, co nie nowe, as Norvid put it, nothing new. But in each different context, national and European, there are different threats to them, different priorities, different in the United States, different in Britain. In France, I want particularly to mention the name of a very brave school teacher, Samuel Paty, who was a few days ago barbarically beheaded by an Islamist terrorist because he stood up for free speech. So in France, you face a classic threat to liberalism, to the core value of liberalism, free speech, which is what I have called the assassin's veto. Independent media are absolutely crucial to this. Rafał Trzaskowski mentioned, of course, the independent courts, the rule of law, which is very important. My own view is that in Poland particularly, in East Central Europe more generally, the key battle of the next 1 to 2 years will be the battle to defend independent media. And what I want to do is to draw Europe's attention, in fact, all other democracies' attention, to this particular battle. And obviously the pandemic gives the danger of offering a pretext for authoritarian moves to be made in the name of fighting the pandemic, as we've seen in Hungary. So that's basket number one, if you will. Traditional goods of liberalism to be defended in new circumstances. Basket number two is the mistakes, the sins of omission and commission of liberalism over the last 30 to 40 years, which we now have to address simultaneously. And the best summary of where we went wrong is a sentence from an article by the wonderful French political scientist Pierre Asner, written already in 1991. Already in 1991, Pierre Asner said, "As we celebrate the triumph of liberty and universality, let us not forget the yearnings that led to nationalism and socialism." And then he named them. He said the yearning for solidarity and equality on the one side, and for community and identity on the other. And that pair of concepts, solidarity and equality on the one hand, community and identity on the other, perfectly captures the territory in which liberals now have to act, and act fast and effectively. In all our societies, we have a dramatic, multi-dimensional inequality. It's not just economic inequality, inequality of income and wealth. It's intergenerational inequality. It's also horizontal inequality, that's to say geographical. In all our countries, we have the problem that certain regions feel themselves to have been left behind by the developments of the last 30 years in the name of liberalism. Eastern and Southeast Poland, the north of England that voted for Brexit, the Rust Belt in the United States, and so on. It's also cultural and educational. It's not just the inequality of wealth, it's what I call the inequality of attention and respect. A large part of our societies feels it themselves to have been ignored and disrespected by liberal elites in the metropolises, those cosmopolitans in Warsaw or Berlin or London or New York. It's inequalities of power, and ultimately it's also what for a liberal is the key point, the inequality of life chances, starting with the most basic life chance, which is the chance to live a long life. In some British cities, life expectancy in the poorest part of the city is about 54, and in the richest part of the city, about 83. That cannot be acceptable in a liberal society. So there's a whole cluster of things that we have to do to address, in the name of solidarity and equality, this multidimensional inequality. Redistribution through tax, a wealth tax, a land tax, a digital tax. Lifting what Ralph Dahrendorf called the common floor, the welfare framework, This is, of course, where peace in Poland moved into the space left open by careless liberals. Now, there's a great deal of support for universal basic income, for example, universal basic services like healthcare, new models of stakeholder capitalism, but also more subtle cultural aspects. So, for example, in education, we're very good at working out what we want to do with people who go to university. But what about the half of our societies that doesn't go into higher education? What do we have to offer them educationally? How much are our media covering with respect and sympathy the neglected and left behind parts of our societies? What are we doing about those structural inequalities of power? That set of answers, properly found, deserves the name solidarity. Solidarność, a value that was once held very important in modern Poland. But at the same time, we have to address the need for community and identity, because the other aspect of this problem is that in those same parts of our societies, people have felt utterly disoriented through the speed and depth of the kind of revolutionary change that capitalism has brought. Globalization, liberalization, Europeanization, digitalization, all coming together until people cry too fast, enough, and go back to the old sources of community and identity like nation, church, and family. So that as liberals, and I think it's very interesting that Rafał Trzaskowski's new movement is called Wspólna Polska. Wspólna, wspólnota, community. That is the key word. We have to find those elements of community about which liberals have been very bad at speaking. Cities and regions, certainly, social groups, but also the nation. One of the mistakes liberals made over the last 30 to 40 years is that we talked so much about Europe and so much about the world and left talk of the nation to the political right and the populace. We have to reclaim the notion of the nation, but in a liberal patriotism, a patriotism which is civic, open, and inclusive. So that's a little bit about the second basket. But now we come to the third basket, which is even more demanding, and this is my bridge to your next panel, because this involves a series of unprecedented global challenges such that liberals have never before faced in the more than 200 years history of liberalism. And obviously, there are many of them, but I'll just mention quickly three. First of all, you talk a lot in Poland about Russia, rightly. But the strategic challenge for liberal democracies, Europe and the West, is China, not Russia. China is already a superpower. Russia is a former superpower. China is a formidable ideological competitor. Its model of developmental authoritarianism is extremely attractive to many people in Africa and Latin America, even to some in Europe. So we have a major ideological competition as we had during the Cold War. But simultaneously, and to a much greater extent than in the first Cold War, we have to cooperate with China to address problems like climate change, the huge challenge of climate change. So green liberalism, the Green New Deal. But even if we deliver on the promise of Europe's Green New Deal, the effects of climate change that is already happening and will not be stopped will be such that we will have not tens of thousands of people trying to get into Europe across the Mediterranean from the wider Middle East and Africa, but hundreds and thousands, if not millions. So a third major global challenge is that of immigration on a much larger scale than we've seen so far. What is the liberal answer to immigration? What is the liberal answer to people who just turn up on our doorstep because they've risked their lives on tiny dinghies to get across the Mediterranean? to lock them up in a camp on a Greek island of Lesbos until the camp burns down. That cannot be the liberal answers. Liberals have always been quite good at addressing what should happen inside the bounds of a given state, a nation state, a polity. But what do we do at the frontier? And here, and this is my final but really important point, here's the rub. To address any one of these issues is difficult enough. To address any one of these baskets of issues is even more difficult. But what we have to do as liberals and liberal Europeans is to address all three sets of issues simultaneously. And it's very easy rhetorically to say the answer is Green New Deal, right? Let's just read Naomi Klein, the Naomi Klein version of the Green New Deal. What we have to do to combat global warming somehow mysteriously also addresses all the other problems of our society, like inequality and exclusion and marginalized groups. Well, that's great as rhetoric, but it's not the reality. Leave the rhetoric to the populace. We need to find real solutions, and there are real tensions between trying to do a Green New Deal and actually, for example, respecting individual liberties, which may have to be limited in the interests of combating global warming, but also what I said a few minutes ago about community and identity. What are we going to say to Polish coal miners or their communities? Sorry, mate, we're just closing your mines. That's it, in the interests of the universal greater good. So we have actually a very complex challenge where we have conflicts, real tensions between what we need to do in one basket and what we need to do in the other. And that's the challenge for us liberals. It's a massively daunting challenge, but we've been here before. Liberalism has been in a dark place and its prospects have looked bad before. Think of the whole first half of the 20th century. And we've come out of it. And I believe we can again, but we cannot do so as single countries. Take this message from Brexit Britain. We have to do this together in the European context, in a wider European context, with Europe as a whole being the vanguard of new liberal solutions. And in that European answer, I would love to hear a stronger liberal Polish voice. And with that, I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Professor Garton Ash. This was, as it was supposed to be, heart uplifting, and therefore we have this hint of optimism in these turbulent times that is so much needed, especially in Poland. And among the questions that we have, and there are many of them, so I have to sum them up a little bit. One I would like to ask as a first question, it looks like the one recipe for all the countries, for liberals, but there is a big difference, and an obvious one. The difference is that there are countries in which illiberals took the power, and the others. And in those in which they are already governing, the question that we have is, does the COVID-19 prove that the illiberals are ineffective? So it would be on this optimistic note that maybe this crisis is a kind of not only a challenge, but also a kind of hope for liberals, because as it could have been seen in the United States and in Poland, illiberals seem not to be so effective as they have promised, at least before the crisis.
I wish I could agree with you, because that would be very encouraging. But I don't think Xi Jinping is a great liberal. But actually, China, after a very bad start where they suppressed information about the virus and let it spread, China has handled it, grosso modo, far more effectively than the United States. So I'm afraid we cannot conclude that illiberal rulers are ineffective in combating a pandemic and liberal rulers are effective. What I think we can conclude, as I said at the beginning, is that populists, those who use a particular tool set for winning power, be it Narendra Modi in India, or Bolsonaro in Brazil, or Kaczynski in Poland, or Boris Johnson in Britain, they, it seems, the evidence suggests, are not good at the kind of governing competence, mastery of detail, realism, calm, also generation of trust that are needed to combat the pandemic. I'd be interested if anyone can point to a single populist ruler, government, which has been effective in fighting COVID. So I think there's some encouragement in that, but not quite as much as you suggest.
Another question is, well, it was, it is not a surprising one, but what should you propose the whole set of problems and possible answers, but as simple men, we should choose something to begin with, and the question is, what should choose Polish liberals in order to make this breakthrough, because we have so many challenges. And just to name this, just to remind these inequalities, that maybe we are able to name so many inequalities that it's simply unprecedented. So what should Polish liberals choose and set as an agenda? Because I think that to make a modest start, we should focus at least on one or two things.
Yes. Okay. Two points. First of all, liberalism, properly understood, has never been a one-size-fits-all ideology, like communism, for example. One of the great mistakes of liberalism in the last 30 years is that it was reduced almost to a single synthetic one-size-fits-all program, so that I think liberals need to see the whole picture. And particularly in Poland, it's important to have that global dimension. But of course, the priorities for liberals will vary from country to country. For example, in Britain, actually our independent anti-majoritarian institutions and our courts are still quite strong. Second point, look, one liberal principle is self-government, so it's ultimately up to Polish liberals to decide what's most important for Polish liberals. But since I've been closely connected with the country for more than 40 years, what I would say is, off the top of my head, two things. First of all, it seems to me absolutely clear that the next step in this strategy of what I have called urbanization à la Polonaise, in other words, following roughly the Viktor Orban playbook, is the attack on the independent media. You can see what happens when it succeeds. Just look at Hungary. Now in Poland, we still have TVN, owned by Discovery, Onet.pl, Agora. So we have at least three enormous independent media groups, as well as very impressive smaller ones. So I think a laser focus, also when you talk to people in the larger EU and the larger West, on the defense of independent pluralistic media would be really important for the next year or two. Secondly, and you mentioned the inequalities, can we try and banish the term Polska B from Poland's political discourse? Because the term is itself part of the problem that I was describing, namely the inequality of attention and respect. There is just as Southern English liberals sitting in Oxford or London like me have a big problem convincing people in the north of England that we actually see them, hear them, take them seriously. I do believe that the liberal intelligentsia in Poland does have a problem conveying that message to people in rural and small town, particularly eastern and southeastern Poland. So anything one can do around the discourse, if you will, to convey that message that we have heard you would seem to me tremendously important. And in this respect, language, and as Carolina Vigora always points out, speaking not just to the intellect but also to the emotions, is tremendously important.
Thank you so much. We have a lot of questions, and I have to choose the very last one, and again, to make a kind of a package out of it. It's a question about the, well, how would we define liberty for the next, for the years to come? And we have the question from Kacper Szulecki from the University of Oslo. Do you believe that climate change requires limiting individual liberties, or rather redefining what liberties are in the context of a common good?
Very interesting question. I had a research project here at Oxford University called Europe Stories, and we've been doing some opinion polling on the priorities of young Europeans, well, of all Europeans, but particularly of the younger generation of Europeans. What do they want the EU to do? And of course, climate change is very near the top of the list. And then we ask the question, do you think authoritarian states are more effective than democracies in combating climate change? 53% of young Europeans said yes. So we have a real problem there. And when one digs deeper, it's not that they think that Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping are doing such a great job, as fellow travelers in the 1930s thought that Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin were doing a great job. It's that they almost despair of the capacity of democracies to make the radical changes necessary quickly enough. So I would reformulate it as a challenge to democracies to do this by consent, to change behaviors in democracies by consent, as well as finding technical and other solutions. So I don't myself think it's about changing the definition of liberty fundamentally. I think that liberalism has thought for more than 200 years about the nature of individual liberty, and that we could have a separate seminar on that. But I do think it is a profound strategic challenge because there is a lack of belief, a lack of trust that democracies can actually get to the right place by consent. And that's why the priorities of the European Union for the next 7 years and the Green New Deal is actually so important, because that's its promise. But as anyone who studied the EU knows, between the promise and the reality, there can often be a large gap.
In what we are trying to tell to our co-citizens, and are they ready to hear it? Because I think, and to close this first part of our conference, I think that you have published the book on the freedom of speech, and I think that it was a little bit too early before we really experienced all those turbulences that we could diagnose when we are seeing how people practice their freedom of speech in the internet in the times of the COVID-19, when everything, as you said, is resonates on a larger scale than before. And I think that we should return to those main liberal values, rethink them, but also go back and see that, as you have mentioned, Pierre Asner, we have a lot in our liberal, not only archives, but on our liberal books to have this food for mind for the future. And I think that, if you permit, that would be our optimistic conclusion of this panel. Thank you so much, Professor Timothy Garton Ash, University of Oxford. It was, as always, a true pleasure to meet and talk.